He was young, ambitious, and rising fast in the FBI. A new agent assigned to the gritty backroads of Kentucky. His job, crack drug rings and track dangerous criminals. People admired his work ethic. His badge carried weight. His word was trusted. Until he became the very thing he was trained to hunt. In one of the most shocking betrayals of the badge in FBI history, a murder investigation would slowly unravel a lie, one that began with seduction, spiraled into obsession, and ended in death. This is the story of the detective who solved his own murder case. There's a certain mythology that surrounds law enforcement, a belief that those who wear the badge are incorruptible, steadfast, and above reproach. In 1987, Mark Putnam was the embodiment of that ideal, or so it seemed. He was clean-cut, charismatic, and determined. A young man from Connecticut who'd worked his way up through discipline, education, and raw ambition. He graduated from the University of Tampa with a degree in criminology, then entered Quantico, the FBI's elite training academy. Putnam excelled. He wasn't the most physically imposing recruit, but he was smart, analytical, methodical. He took notes, he studied behavior. He was the kind of agent who knew the rules and followed them. His instructors saw something in him, a kind of quiet confidence, a seriousness about the job. When he graduated from the academy, the Bureau assigned him to his first field office in Pikeville, Kentucky, a rural, isolated part of the Appalachian Mountains, far from the political glamour of Washington, D.C. It was not a place you sent someone you wanted to reward. It was where you sent someone to test them. Pikeville was the heart of coal country. Generations of poverty, tight-knit families, thick accents, and deep, unspoken loyalties. It was a region grappling with economic decay and a growing epidemic of drugs, painkillers, amphetamines, meth. The drug trade was rooted in local families, sometimes passed down like inheritance. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion, and law enforcement didn't always get the welcome they expected. For Mark Putnam, this was his proving ground. He wanted to make a difference and make a name for himself in the process. To make arrests in Pikeville, you needed more than a badge. You needed intel, the kind that didn't show up in databases or wiretaps. You needed someone on the inside, and that someone was Susan Daniels Smith. Susan was born and raised in the area. She knew the hills, the people, the whispers. She wasn't hardened, but she had seen things. She had a rap sheet, theft, drug possession, minor charges. She had also been around real criminals, drug dealers, smugglers, users, and she knew their routines. A young mother of two, Susan lived on the edge of survival. When Putnam offered her money in exchange for information, she agreed. It was a simple trade, names for cash, tips for safety. She became a confidential informant, CI 167. At first, the relationship was strictly professional. Putnam gave her instructions. She delivered. He paid her in Bureau-approved envelopes. It was clean. It was controlled. But over time, things changed. They met more often. Their meetings grew longer, less formal, less procedural. Susan began to trust him. Or maybe she needed to. He was handsome, polite. He wore a suit, drove a government car. She called him Agent Mark. He called her Susie. What happened next depends on who you ask. Susan told close friends she was in love with Putnam, that they had an affair, that she believed he loved her back. She said she was carrying his child, that he promised to leave his wife, to start over. Putnam would later admit something happened, but only once, only briefly, and only after the pressure became too much to bear. But pressure has a way of compounding, especially when you're living two lives. Mark Putnam had a wife, Kathy, and a young daughter. They had relocated to Pikeville together. Kathy stayed at home while Mark worked long hours building his cases. She trusted him, implicitly. He was the golden boy, the rising star, and in Washington people were taking notice. But no one knew about Susan. No one knew what she was saying to her friends. That she was pregnant. That Mark was distancing himself. That he was cold, afraid, desperate. Susan, feeling abandoned, threatened to go public. She hinted that she would expose the affair, ruin his marriage, his career, his future. She didn't want money anymore. She wanted acknowledgement, maybe love, maybe revenge. And then she vanished. On June 8, 1989, Susan Smith disappeared. No one saw her leave. Her purse was missing. Her car was still there. Her children were left behind. At first, it didn't spark a major investigation. People assumed she had run off. She had done it before, but this time, she never came back. And quietly, behind the scenes, the FBI was watching one of its own. The man who had recruited her, used her, and now claimed to know nothing about where she went. Susan Smith vanished on a Thursday evening, June 8, 1989. She had told her sister she was going to meet someone. She didn't say who. She never came home. Her children were left with family. Her purse, usually glued to her side, was nowhere to be found. No calls, no letters, no goodbyes, just silence. At first, no one panicked. Susan had gone off before, sometimes for a few days, to cool off or escape trouble. But this time felt different, too long, too quiet. Her sister started calling around. Friends said they hadn't seen her. Her mother grew worried. When Susan failed to return after several days, her family reported her missing to the local police. But in Pikeville, where resources were limited and missing persons reports were common, the case didn't raise alarms, not right away. There were no immediate leads, no witnesses, no body. Just the ache of a growing absence and a trail that seemed to vanish into thin air. Somehow, the FBI learned of her disappearance within days. And that's when the story takes an unusual turn. Mark Putnam, her former handler, the federal agent who'd worked with her for over a year, stepped in to assist with the missing persons investigation. He was calm, collected, professional. He told colleagues that Susan had become unstable, erratic, that she had a history of drug use and emotional outbursts, that she'd lied before, about him, about a supposed affair. He said he hadn't seen her, didn't know where she was, and yet he asked to stay involved. He volunteered information, even reviewed her case file. Why would a federal agent offer to help investigate the disappearance of a woman who had publicly threatened him just weeks earlier? Mark Putnam said it was out of duty, that he wanted closure for her family. Others weren't so sure. By July, local law enforcement had begun to grow suspicious, not just about Susan's fate, but about Putnam's behavior. He was showing up unannounced, asking questions, poking around her known hangouts. He claimed it was for the file, for accuracy, for protocol, but something felt off. And then, a break. One of Susan's friends came forward. She said Susan had told her just days before disappearing that she was meeting with Mark, that she had planned to confront him one last time, demand responsibility for the child she claimed to be carrying. She was angry, she felt betrayed, and she wasn't backing down. That statement turned the spotlight directly onto the FBI's golden boy. Putnam denied it. He said the last time he saw Susan was months earlier, that he had nothing to do with her disappearance, but inconsistencies began to surface. Timelines that didn't match, phone calls that were never logged, receipts, witnesses, and beneath his carefully maintained facade, cracks were forming. A year passed. No body was found, no arrest was made. But one federal agent, a man known for his precision and control, was starting to unravel. By the fall of 1989, months had passed since Susan Smith vanished. No body, no witnesses, no official suspect. But quietly, in the halls of the FBI field offices and the corridors of Pikeville's local precincts, something unspoken lingered. Doubt. And that doubt pointed in one direction. Mark Putnam was still playing the part. Dutiful, cooperative, even helpful. He spoke to investigators without resistance, reviewed notes, attended briefings. He offered theories that Susan had relapsed into drugs, run away, maybe even left the state. To some, it was convincing. He was a federal agent after all, clean record, rising star. But the cracks had begun to show. He was nervous, repeating himself, offering details no one asked for, avoiding eye contact. One local officer later recalled, he seemed rehearsed, like he'd memorized his innocence. The deeper investigators looked, the more troubling inconsistencies emerged. Putnam said he hadn't seen Susan in weeks before she vanished. But a gas station clerk remembered seeing her get into a white FBI-issued sedan the night she disappeared. A second witness, her neighbor, reported hearing a heated argument in the early evening, just outside Susan's home. She claimed the man's voice sounded formal, like a teacher or lawyer. Then there were the phone records, a series of late-night calls traced to a payphone just 3 blocks from Susan's apartment. The caller? Unconfirmed. The timing? Suspicious. Still, there was no physical evidence, no body, no crime scene. Nothing that could justify a formal charge. But pressure was mounting, not just from Pikeville law enforcement, but from within the Bureau itself. Putnam's own colleagues had begun to whisper. His supervisor had grown distant, and quietly, the FBI ordered a polygraph test. During the test, Putnam was asked the critical questions. Did you see Susan Smith the day she disappeared? Did you have anything to do with her vanishing? Did you harm her? The results were inconclusive, but the examiner noted unusual stress markers and evasive breathing patterns. Putnam didn't ask for a retest. He simply walked away. It wasn't just the investigation weighing on him. At home, his marriage was strained. Kathy, his wife, had heard the rumors. She knew Susan, knew her name, her face, knew that something wasn't right. Putnam spent more time alone. He was drinking more, isolating. His performance dropped. Reports went unfinished. Cases stalled. He had built his entire career on control, of details, of emotions, of narratives. And now, that control was slipping. Then, in early 1990, nearly a year after Susan vanished, everything changed. Putnam requested a meeting with his supervisor. He didn't ask for legal counsel. He didn't bring a lawyer. He simply said, "There's something I need to talk about." And within hours, one of the FBI's most promising young agents would go from investigator to suspect. It began like any other meeting. On a warm June morning in 1990, Mark Putnam walked into the FBI field office in Louisville. He wore a dress shirt, tucked in, no jacket, no lawyer. He was carrying nothing, no files, no badge, only the weight of what he could no longer carry inside. He sat down across from his supervisor. He didn't speak right away, just stared at his hands. Then, after a long silence, he said 7 words that changed everything. "I'm the one who killed Susan Smith." For over a year, Putnam had denied everything. He maintained professionalism, filed reports, smiled at colleagues, lived a life of routine. But beneath the surface, his mind had been eroding. The guilt was corrosive, the silence unbearable, and his carefully constructed world, the image of the clean-cut, rising star FBI agent, had begun to unravel. The confession was not rushed. It came out in waves, like someone emptying a locked chest, piece by piece. He told investigators how Susan had contacted him again in June 1989, insisting they meet. She was angry, emotional. She threatened to expose everything: their affair, the pregnancy, his betrayal. Putnam had a wife, a daughter, a career he had spent years building. In his mind, Susan had become a liability, a threat to everything he stood to lose. He agreed to meet her one last time, not in public, not at her apartment, but in the remote hills of Freeburn, a quiet spot near a logging road just outside town. There, under a darkening sky, they sat in his FBI-issued sedan, and things escalated quickly. Susan pleaded with him, accused him, begged him. She demanded that he take responsibility for their relationship and the child she believed was his. Putnam later claimed he tried to calm her down, that she attacked him first, that she scratched his neck, pulled his shirt, screamed. He said it was instinct, that he didn't mean to do it. He reached forward, both hands around her throat, and squeezed. According to his confession, it lasted just seconds, but those seconds would follow him for the rest of his life. Susan's body went limp. Her voice fell silent, and for the first time, Mark Putnam realized what he had done. His training should have stopped him. His conscience should have screamed. But in that moment, he was no longer an agent. He was a man who had killed someone he once called a friend. Putnam panicked. He pulled her body from the car, dragged her into the woods. He didn't have gloves, no tools, no plan. Using his bare hands, he dug a shallow grave in the hard soil beneath a cluster of trees. He covered her body with dirt, leaves, and fallen branches. Then he walked away. He got in his car, drove back into town, showered, slept next to his wife, and went to work the next morning like nothing had happened. For 12 months, he lived with it, haunted, sleepless. Some nights, he would wake drenched in sweat. His performance at work declined. He avoided mirrors. He avoided people. And eventually, he couldn't avoid himself. When the confession ended, the room was silent. Agents didn't speak. The weight of the betrayal was overwhelming. Mark Putnam, the FBI's rising star, had crossed the line. Not just ethically, not just professionally. He had murdered his own informant, covered it up, then joined the search to find her. With the location disclosed, agents followed Putnam's directions to an isolated spot in the woods outside Freeburn. There, under shallow dirt and stone, they found what was left of Susan Smith. Still clothed, still alone, the case was officially closed. The body was recovered. The killer was in custody. But justice would not bring closure. Not for Susan's children, not for her family, and not for a community that had once believed in the man who wore the badge. On June 12, 1990, 4 days after his confession, Mark Putnam led authorities up an overgrown mountain trail near Freeburn, Kentucky. The agents followed his directions precisely. A right turn off a forgotten logging road, a steep slope down through brambles and ferns, and then a clearing beneath the trees. There, in the earth, were the remains of Susan Smith. The shallow grave was no more than 2 feet deep. The soil had been disturbed by rain and animals. Her body had begun to surface. She had been buried in the clothes she was last seen wearing, a pair of jeans, a pink blouse, and white sneakers. Even after a year in the ground, some strands of her auburn hair were still intact. The coroner would later confirm that Susan had died from asphyxiation, strangulation, consistent with Putnam's confession. Her hyoid bone, a small U-shaped bone in the neck, had been fractured, a common indicator in manual strangulation cases. She had likely died within seconds, but the suffering left invisible scars. For investigators, it was surreal. An active FBI agent, a man who had once led others through crime scenes, was now narrating his own. Putnam's story was laid bare. He had driven her to the secluded spot under the pretense of talking. She had climbed into the car believing she'd get answers, maybe even a confession of love. What she got was a death sentence, and what haunted so many was not just the act itself, but what followed. Putnam returned to town, washed his hands, slept beside his wife, went back to work. Then he inserted himself into the investigation. He reviewed search maps, read witness statements, participated in strategy sessions, smiled at Susan's grieving mother, and shook her hand. His performance fooled nearly everyone. As news of the recovery broke, shockwaves rippled across Kentucky and the rest of the country. The headlines were explosive. FBI agent confesses to murder. Federal investigator leads police to victim's body. Badge and betrayal, the Susan Smith story. TV crews descended on Pikeville. Reporters stood outside courtrooms. Every detail of the case was dissected. Mark Putnam went from model agent to national disgrace overnight. For Susan's family, the discovery was bittersweet. They had answers, but no comfort. Her sister wept during the press conference. Her mother, distraught and shaking, held up a picture of Susan as a child, smiling in a red dress. She trusted him, her mother said, and he killed her like she was nothing. Putnam was arrested and formally charged with first-degree manslaughter, a plea deal negotiated to avoid a prolonged trial. He pleaded guilty. There was no courtroom drama, no jury, just a quiet admission of guilt. The sentence, 16 years in prison. But many would ask, was that enough? When Mark Putnam pled guilty in a small Kentucky courtroom, there were no gasps, no cries, just silence. A man once sworn to uphold justice had murdered a woman he was sworn to protect. There would be no trial, no drawn-out appeals, no denial, just guilt and time. Putnam was sentenced to 16 years in federal prison for first-degree manslaughter. He would serve his time in a minimum security facility, a quiet prison in the Florida Panhandle, far from the hills of Pikeville, and far from Susan Smith's grave. The sentence outraged many. How could a federal agent, a trained professional who killed, buried, and lied for a year, receive just 16 years? Susan's family was devastated. Her sister Shelby called the sentence a disgrace. Her mother refused to attend the sentencing. She said she couldn't bear to see him breathe. Susan's 2 young children were left without a mother. They were raised by relatives, far from media attention. They were told years later the full story. And then there was Kathy Putnam, Mark's wife. Kathy had stood by him for years. She had moved with him to Kentucky, raised their daughter, kept his secrets. At first, she believed him, believed the affair was just a rumor, believed the accusations were baseless. But when the truth came out, the confession, the burial site, the child Susan claimed to be carrying, Kathy's world collapsed. She filed for divorce, quietly, without spectacle, then disappeared from a public view. She would later die of organ failure in 1998, alone and just 38 years old. Friends say she never fully recovered. As for Mark Putnam, prison didn't seem to change him outwardly. He read books, taught Bible study, earned the nickname Preacher from other inmates. He served just 13 years before being released in 2000 for good behavior. He walked out a free man, the first FBI agent in history to be convicted of homicide. He relocated, changed his name, remarried, started a new life in the South. Today, he lives quietly, No social media, no interviews, no trace. He has never spoken publicly about Susan's death again. And yet, for all his attempts to disappear, the story continues to echo. Susan's grave is still visited. Her family still mourns. And in the shadows of Pikeville, people still remember the FBI agent who crossed the line. He wore the badge, led the investigation, and in the end, solved his own murder case. At just 31 years old, Mark Putnam traded in his tailored suits and FBI credentials for a prison jumpsuit and an inmate number. Federal inmate 26798-034. His new home, the Federal Correctional Institution in Tallahassee, Florida, a low-security prison that housed mostly white-collar criminals and nonviolent offenders. But Putnam's crime was neither of those. He wasn't like the others. He had murdered a woman, lied to the Bureau, helped bury the truth, and then her body. And yet, inside those walls, he adapted. He kept his head down, avoided confrontation, took jobs in the prison library and chapel. He became known as Preacher, not because of religion, but because of his calm, articulate way of speaking. Some inmates said he never raised his voice. Others said he gave advice to younger men, helping them draft appeals, guiding them through self-help programs. To the prison staff, he was a model inmate, respectful, clean, distant. But was it remorse or self-preservation? Over the years, he became a ghost in the system, rarely speaking of his crime, never acknowledging Susan by name. When pressed, he described it as a mistake, a loss of control, a tragedy that should never have happened. But those who knew the case knew the truth was far uglier. Kathy Putnam, his ex-wife, never visited. She kept her distance, raising their daughter alone. She died in 1998, just 8 years into his sentence. Some believe her death, linked to organ failure, was worsened by the stress and shame she carried. Mark did not attend her funeral. Inside prison, time moves differently. Days bleed into weeks, weeks into years. By 1999, after nearly a decade behind bars, Putnam had become almost invisible. No disciplinary write-ups, no fights, no outbursts, just silence and waiting. Then, in 2000, 13 years after Susan's death, the Bureau of Prisons quietly approved his release. Early, for good behavior. He walked out alone. No press, no protest, no apology. He had served 13 years for killing a woman with his bare hands. And just like that, he was free. Putnam disappeared into the fabric of American life. He changed his name, moved to the South, remarried, started over. No public interviews, no memoir, no documentary, just shadows. Some say he lives quietly in Georgia. Others say he moved out west. Official records vanish after a point, sealed, redacted, forgotten. But freedom doesn't always mean peace. The FBI may have closed the file, but for the family Susan left behind, the sentence never ended. While Mark Putnam quietly disappeared into a new life, Susan Smith's family was left to pick up the shattered pieces of the one she left behind. For them, the story didn't end in a courtroom or a prison gate. It lived on, in every empty seat at a birthday table, every Mother's Day card left unwritten, and in 2 young children who would grow up without the one person they needed most. Susan had 2 kids, a son and a daughter. When she vanished in June of 1989, her children were just toddlers, too young to understand the weight of the headlines, too innocent to grasp the loss. They were raised by Susan's sister Shelby and other relatives, people who tried their best to keep them safe from the media, from the shame, from the cruelty of whispered judgment in a small town. But the truth has a way of creeping in. As they got older, they asked questions. Where was their mother? Why didn't she come home? Who was the man she trusted, the man who ended her life? Shelby tried to answer them gently. But how do you explain to a child that their mother was murdered by an FBI agent? That the man who took her life was supposed to protect it? Susan's family never recovered. Her mother, Patty, lived the rest of her life with a quiet sadness. She refused to speak Mark Putnam's name. She kept Susan's childhood drawings in a shoebox under her bed. When asked by a reporter if she ever forgave him, she answered, "I forgave God, not him." Susan's sister, Shelby, became the keeper of memory, the one who told the truth when others wanted to move on. Every year, she returned to Susan's grave. Every year, she left a single white rose. The small cemetery in Pikeville became a kind of shrine, not to fame, not to justice, but to unfinished grief. There is no plaque for Mark Putnam, no statute for Susan, no court that can give back what was taken. But in that quiet corner of Kentucky, people remember. Susan Smith never had the chance to rebuild, to raise her kids, to start over. Her story was swallowed by headlines, by scandal, by the title informant. But she was more than that. She was a mother, a daughter, a woman trying to do better in a world that kept closing in. And when she needed protection the most, she was betrayed by the one person trained to deliver it. That betrayal doesn't fade. It ripples across generations, across lives. When the public learned that an active FBI agent had murdered his own informant, the reaction was swift and volatile. Newspapers ran headlines that stunned readers across the country. The scandal reached the halls of Congress. Pundits called for accountability. Victims' advocates demanded reform. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Bureau might face a reckoning. And yet, very little changed. The FBI issued a short statement in 1990, shortly after Mark Putnam's conviction. The Bureau condemns all criminal acts committed by its personnel. This case does not reflect the values of the FBI, nor the standards to which our agents are held. That was it. No press conference, no formal apology to Susan's family, no open hearings, just a brief acknowledgement, and then silence. Behind closed doors, there were whispers of internal reviews, quiet investigations, and classified memos. But to this day, the details of any disciplinary or procedural changes remain sealed. There was no independent oversight, no new legislation introduced, no major shift in how informants were handled. Internally, some agents were shaken. They had worked alongside Putnam, shared desks, trusted his reports. One former colleague, speaking anonymously, said, "It felt like we missed something. Something we were trained to catch. But he was one of us, and maybe that blinded us." Mark Putnam became a ghost in Bureau history. Not a cautionary tale, not a case study, just a name quietly erased. He is rarely mentioned in FBI training academies. His file, once marked by promise, is now a sealed footnote. His case is not taught to new agents. There is no mandatory review protocol based on what happened. And what about Susan? No FBI director ever spoke her name. No agent delivered an apology. No one in uniform attended her funeral. She was collateral damage, of ego, of power, of unchecked authority. The Bureau moved on, quietly, efficiently. But the public didn't forget. And neither did those who saw the case for what it really was, a system designed to protect the enforcers, even when they become the criminals. Some say the Bureau learned a lesson. Others say it simply learned how to hide the stain better. Either way, justice was served, but trust was not restored. Mark Putnam never ran. He didn't skip town or destroy evidence. He didn't wait for a knock at the door. He opened the door himself. In June 1990, he walked into an FBI office, sat down, and solved the one case no one ever expected him to. His own. He confessed to strangling Susan Smith, led investigators to her body, described her final moments with mechanical precision, like he was reading from a report, and in doing so, he became something the Bureau had never seen before: an FBI agent who investigated and closed the murder he himself committed. He served 13 years, not 30, not life. 13. Then quietly re-entered society under a new name, vanished into the fabric of America, and lived on. Meanwhile, Susan was buried beneath a modest headstone in rural Kentucky. No protection, no press, no closure. She was the one who trusted the badge. He was the one who weaponized it. Today, Mark Putnam lives in silence. No books, no interviews, no accountability. But in the minds of those who remember this case, a question still lingers. Did he confess because he was haunted by guilt, or because he knew the story was already closing in on him? One man, one murder, one confession, one legacy, forever stained. This was the story of the detective who solved his own murder case.